Thank you very much, Simone, and thank you for the invitation to speak today. It's a great pleasure to be talking about this subject. It's an area I've been working in for getting on for 20 years now, it's sad in some ways that things change over the course of a generation, but exciting to see so many more people interested in how we're able to get participant input into clinical trials. So in terms of the structure for today, so I'm going to give an overview, I think, of maybe where the field has been and maybe give you some frameworks to think about as we go through. I'm going to try and give some worked examples and some resources that you could look to if you were trying to incorporate this type of work in your own practice, and then close with a couple of ideas for next steps. I'm then going to hand over to my colleague, Noah Goodson, and we're going to work through a specific case study and talk about a very interesting sort of innovative technology approach to getting patient input. And then we'll try and make sure that there's time at the end for some questions as well. So before we do that, though, I'm going to take this opportunity to basically try and pitch a job to you. So we're going to try and recruit for some lucky candidates for the opportunity of a lifetime. So what I'd like you to do is think about whether or not this is something you might like to apply for. So a funded researcher is looking for someone like you, an altruistic volunteer, to have an unpaid research position. Unfortunately, we don't have budget for that, but you're very altruistic, so I'm sure you'll want to take part in your own spare time for fun. If you're successful in this role, what we're going to ask you to do, you have to travel very long distances, and we're going to stick some needles in you and draw some blood and ask you lots of questions. If you have any kind of pre-existing medical conditions or anything like that, we're going to mess up all your plans and interfere with all the things that your doctors have done in the past. We're going to ask you about some really sensitive personal topics via a bunch of sort of check the box questionnaires that won't really fully address how you've been living. Whilst you're doing all this, please, pack some sandwiches or something like that, because we're not really going to cover your expenses all that well, or your meals. If you have to travel into a city in the middle of rush hour or something like that, maybe we'd encourage you to take a bus and keep the receipt, and maybe in about a year's time we'll reimburse you for that. And then if someone needs to look after your kids or look after your parents or something like that, we're not going to help with that. You just take care of that yourself somehow via the power of magic. So if you were to take this role, which would be as a research volunteer, about half of you, we're actually not going to treat you at all. We're actually just going to give you sugar pills due to some confusing effect that we don't really understand. So you might feel like your participation is not going to be all that impactful. And the good news is, when this is all done, we'll take the results and we'll publish them in secret somewhere you can't read, with a whole bunch of 5-syllable words that don't make sense to anybody. Are you interested? You want to take part in this? Does it sound compelling? Would you give up your Fridays to do this? Possibly not. So why do we expect clinical trial participants to take part in endeavors like this? And I think the answer of just altruism and to help other people and things like that perhaps has a place, for sure. But I think increasingly now we all lead such busy lives that some of those assumptions no longer hold up. And I think really the system needs to change if we want to make this a more compelling proposition. I know when I look at a lot of protocols, I think, could I do this? Could I take my unwell family member who's got motor neuron disease? Could I take time off work and go in and help him take part in this study? And oftentimes my answer is, I would really, really like to, but it's just not going to work. So how do we get to this point? How do we get to the situation where taking part in a trial feels like an arduous part-time job that you don't really want to have? So there's a variety of sort of external factors driving towards this. So I think we all know how difficult it is for new drugs to come through the system. Various people come up with different quotes for these, but one of the big challenges here is efficiency, the apparent decrease in efficiency over time that we seem to be seeing. So as opposed to Moore's law, where microprocessors get twice as efficient every 18 months, Eroom's law, which is the palindrome of that, suggests that actually the efficiency of R&D actually halves about every 9 years. So, whereas progress in technology and gadgets and smartwatches are getting faster all the time, drug development seems to be getting harder. Alongside that, partially because everyone wants to cover all bases and not miss an interesting secondary outcome, we're seeing massive increases year on year, decade on decade, in the number of things you have to do. That could be questionnaires, it could be additional visits, it could be scans, it could be blood draws. Hey, let's get your genome just in case. Hey, let's do a lumbar puncture just in case. And these all contribute to participant burden. Oh, sorry, that went back. So as a result, perhaps it's sad, but not that surprising that a very small percentage of people actually take part in trials. that far too many trials enroll no participants whatsoever, and that about half are missing targets. As you are an audience who wants to improve your practice in clinical trials, I imagine your studies are quite well run, but more broadly, a lot of participants do worry that they're not treated very well in a trial. And I think when you look at the sort of participant feedback in the literature, certainly the experiences that we would want to have everybody to experience are not consistently applied. Again, one of the things that's perhaps driving this, and this data is a little old now, but if you ask people that work at clinical trial sponsors, at CROs, even senior academics, and you ask them how many of them actually involve participants themselves in the trial design, the proportion of respondents is very low. And we'll get to that a little bit later on and sort of see where they were changing. So that's the kind of situation that we sort of have now. So how can we address this? So, obviously I can run around saying, just talk to patients all day long, but that's actually not that helpful. So one of the frameworks, and you might have seen this before in terms of patient centricity or participation of citizens in decision-making in government and things like that more broadly, is called Arnstein's ladder. And what this does is it tries to divvy up different degrees of engagement into sort of a hierarchy, if you like. So at the very bottom, we are going to say design a clinical trial where we're actually going to lie to the participants. So that would be manipulation. So that's where we see some of the worse ethical violations of things like the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. So clearly, we definitely don't want to be operating at that level. Some of the worst practices of this have been detailed by people like Ben Goldacre in his book Bad Pharma, and hopefully there's lots of legislation and regulation and increased vigilance around these areas to stop things like that happening again. Further up from that, we have different degrees of tokenism. So at level 3, we might tell a given community of, say, parents of children with a rare disease or people living with asthma or something like that, we might say, we are doing this clinical trial. Above that, we say, well, we might consult with them. So consulting is just listening. So we're going to have a listening session with 20 people, we're going to do a survey or something like that. But there's no sort of requirement for us to act on that. So, 100% of people could say, we want the trial to be like this, and we can ignore it, right? So we're just consulting them. The next step above that is placation. Okay, so they've given us 10 suggestions. Can we take a taxi to King's because it's very difficult to get there by train? We'll placate that one issue, but all the other things they've asked to do, it's still up to us, right? We still hold all the power. And to some degree, one of the criticisms of patient engagement, patient involvement more generally, do revolve around tokenism. So one example would be some of the work that the FDA has done, probably not so much recently, but following on from HIV advocates protesting about a variety of issues in the 1980s, the FDA put in a program from the 1990s onwards where they would have a few patient representatives advising on various bits and pieces. But over the course of decades, they only ever enrolled about 100 patients in this program, and it was very, uncertain whether or not any of that advice is really listened to. And I think the feeling was that type of thing is just paying lip service because these people don't have any real power. So I think where we would like to see things go is maybe some of these higher levels of citizen participation here. So level 6 here would be partnership. So we're not just giving one sort of token issue that the participants have asked for. We're actually working with them in a more consistent way over time, and perhaps starting to give up some of our control and move up to things more like delegated power. So, for example, in the I-SPY 2 breast cancer trial, which had something like 40 people with lived experience of breast cancer contributing to all different parts of the study, the participants themselves were actually delegated to do some of the translations of the enrollment forms and information into Spanish. And that was particularly relevant because they might come with their own particular social and more nuanced understanding of how to translate certain terms than just, say, a medical translator would. At the more extreme end, and this is probably a bit more controversial for academic or industrial audiences, but is citizen control. And that would be to say, actually, research doesn't just have to happen at institutions and facilities. Maybe you could do your own research. You could, do your own experimentation, maybe with some scientific oversight, maybe completely without. And that is the sort of citizen control model. So some examples across these. So I would argue that in terms of partnership and delegated power, there are good examples. So for example, the Patients Included movement, seeks to get patients themselves involved in the steering committees and on stage and participating at conferences, in medical education, and even in journals. So the BMJ is one of the early participants in that. And as an example of delegated power, if you submit a clinical trial about, say, asthma to flagship BMJ and a number of the BMJ group's journals, someone with asthma is going to be asked to peer review that manuscript. They're not going to be asked to comment on the p-values and whether you did a Bonferroni correction. They are going to be giving their opinion on whether or not you were measuring something that mattered to them, and whether or not those outcomes would be really meaningful. And they have the exact same weight as, you know, a peer reviewer with a PhD or an MD. So that's a real example of sort of giving that real power. And similarly, at Patients Included, the idea that a patient is shaping the agenda of the conference is important, right? As opposed to just, well, we're going to have a heart disease conference. To make everyone feel better, we'll have one speaker with heart disease come up and give us their heart-wrenching story, and we'll all feel better about what great people we are, right? I think that era has passed. If you're interested in what some of the extremes look like, there are examples here, like in the "We Are Not Waiting" hashtag in diabetes. People living with type 1, type 2 diabetes actually developed their own modifications of continuous glucose monitors. They shared their data in the cloud. In some cases, they actually hacked their continuous glucose monitors into their insulin pumps with crowdsourced software, and actually made their own closed loop artificial pancreases. There's about 3,000 people around the world using a system like this. There's, in the disease that I work in, ALS or motor neuron disease, there's an advocacy group called I Am ALS, and many of its members have been lobbying extensively for things like expanded access programs, and just various different approaches to drug development that would move things a lot faster given the poor prognosis of that condition. So as you think about your own activities, I think a framework like this is quite useful, and it's useful to be able to challenge ourselves to say, well, okay, are we actually giving some real power to people, or are we just, you know, doing a bit of lip service here? So why would we even want patients to be involved? So I'll hopefully give you a carrot and a stick here. So there's not tons of evidence on this, and clearly some of the people generating the evidence have a vested interest here, but there's some research to suggest that we can start to calculate a return on engagement of actually investing time and resources in getting patient input into our studies that show themselves in fewer trial failures, fewer protocol amendments, better attrition, perhaps even greater likelihood that the outcomes we're affecting are better when it comes to an economic and market access type discussion later on in the development process. A more academic study was looking at, again, sort of more investigator-initiated or government-funded research, and found improvements in enrollment and retention, although perhaps not as significant as the industry-funded CTTI group there, or sort of industry studying CTTI group, I should say. And what's the stick, right? So we're all very busy. Everybody has to teach and research and mentor and manage and sit in committees, all the rest of it. So why should patient involvement come up as a priority? Well, I think the stick is starting to come into play. So right now, the FDA does have a whole office of patient-focused drug development. And right now, the situation is that FDA recommends that stakeholders engage with patients. So that's not yet at the point of it's the law or it's mandated. However, I feel like things are rumbling in that direction. And so it would be wise to get ahead of these issues. In the UK, and this is very timely because there's a public consultation open now that closes on Monday, March 14th, the MHRA is actually considering writing it into legislation to have the types of things that we're talking about here become part of the standard operating procedure of clinical research. And at other places in the system, funders like NIHR, Wellcome Trust, publishers like the BMJ now insist that you have to detail your plans for participant involvement. So I think the why, aside from it being a good thing to do in terms of social justice, is starting to become pretty compelling. So if we look at the sort of overall pipeline, if you like, of drug development, and obviously there's quite a high level view, where do we normally see patient involvement? So if these are the strategic decision points that we need to make about different molecules, say, and we see this narrowing funnel of all the possible things that could work down to some medicines that we actually test in humans. We can see the growing number of actual participants that will be affected in research before we actually get to a submission and then a new therapy comes to market. So certainly in my experience, what normally happens is patient involvement doesn't start until here. You've designed a clinical trial, you've done all the paperwork, you worked very hard at it, we're years and years and years into the development cycle, and no one wants to take part in your trial. That's currently the point at which a lot of people phone up people like me and my colleagues and say, help, we're in rescue mode. Honestly, there are very few modifications we can make to your website, your leaflet, making nice pictures, making the click-through rates of your emails work a bit better, that are going to overcome structural issues that started years and years before. The other place that we sometimes see it is more from an industry perspective. When we want to engage with patients, we say, great, we've got this new drug about to launch. Could you come and say what a terrible issue it is living with condition X that my drug happens to treat? And again, I think that's very, it's obvious to the community what people are trying to do here. And the question is, well, why didn't you engage with us earlier on to figure out if this really is an issue for us? So amongst the types of questions that people could ask very early on, right from the strategic initiation of this, how will answering a particular research question ultimately benefit patients? And is this the most important thing we could be doing relative to all the other ways we could be spending resources? I think a lot of the time we see so many diseases, 95% of rare diseases have no treatment. And yet a lot of the time we see a new treatment come to market that is the 17th drug on the market for a particular condition. And I think quite reasonably, a lot of patients would look and say, well, why aren't we trying new things here? Once we go from sort of the preclinical world to first in human, we need to start understanding, well, what is the burden for the participant, not just in terms of the side effects or whether the drug needs to be injected or infused or whatever, but actually as we put in our checklist of all the nice things that would be great to study one day, how much time is that going to take, over what period of time, how expensive is it going to be for people to grab the bus or take the day off work or what have you, and throw all their childcare into disrepair for a long time in order to get it done. And then, like I say, maybe there are some parts here where we can actually say, well, can we engage with a group and actually work with them so that they're partners throughout this. And groups like the Patient-Focused Medicines Development Initiative have provided a great deal of thinking and resources and toolkits that you can look at to actually go into the nitty-gritty, because you might be asking, well, how specifically do we do this? Is it focus groups, is it surveys, is it workshops, what have you? And the good news is that there are a lot of resources and a lot of knowledge in the community. So we'll have some resources towards the end. So as an example, one of the most well-known groups that is in the sort of before kind of area is the James Linder Lines. So they do these, very rigorous pieces of work that I think stand up for a good few years about trying to understand the top priorities of different communities. For my own part, I thought one of the questions that was very interesting was about dyskinesia. So if you look in the way they've sort of ranked it here, that comes up at item number 3. I've been asked to do pieces of work before for companies that have a drug for dyskinesia, and essentially what they will ask is, hey, can you go and prove out the dyskinesias are the most impactful thing, the most burdensome thing in patients' lives to justify why we need to do it? And the thing is, I think that's not really helpful, because if you over focus on the particular hammer that you have, and so you only go looking for nails, you're actually missing out on a lot of these other issues here, and being unrealistic about perhaps how interesting participants might find it, the clinicians might find it, and ultimately payers and prescribers. So there are a variety of different approaches. So this is one approach that's quite sort of intensive. Obviously, COVID's made it harder to get people into sort of real life workshops where we can put sticky notes on things. But again, we can now use tools like Zoom and Miro to do similar things. A different approach is taken by the FDA. So around the time that Obamacare was coming in, the patient-focused drug development work stream was spun up, and they did, again, some in-person meetings. I think to that point on tokenism, I think one of the challenges there was that they only did half a dozen of these meetings per year. If you think of how many diseases there are, it would take sort of till the end of time to let everybody have their say. And ultimately, it was people telling their stories, not really generating data. And it's still quite unclear whether or not any of that input has actually had an impact on decisions. This is an example of some data that we pulled from PatientsLikeMe and actually sent in for this submission. The Michael J. Fox Foundation and many other Parkinson's disease societies did too. But the point here was just to say, when you start drawing quantitative data to pull into this, you might get quite a different impression from, say, the scientific literature or smaller focus groups. And so it's important to be able to give people a range of perspectives on how important different topics are in a given condition. And to state the obvious, if you ask the same question in different ways, you're going to get different answers. So the question's very much around how do we do this in a way that's objective and that we don't fool ourselves into just confirming what we want to be true in terms of the mechanism of action that we think we solve. One of the approaches that I've used a lot, and I would advocate people to consider if it's one they might be able to take as well, is the idea of getting systematic participant feedback on the protocol. I don't mean send a 200-page protocol out to a bunch of people and ask them to mark it up and track changes. What I mean is to break up the elements into the sort of patient-facing elements, right? So the what's involved for me aspect. So elements like, well, what's the aim of the trial? Are you trying to slow down my condition? Are you trying to treat my symptoms? Are you trying to reverse it? Are you trying to cure it? What are you trying to do? How long does the trial last? And very often we talk about the different phases, but functionally to a person who perhaps doesn't think in terms of weeks or months, are you talking about a 2-year commitment, a 5-year commitment? And kind of, can we convey the level of intensity, right? Because it can often be very intense at the beginning with screening and enrollment, but then it might sort of taper off a little bit. How long do I need to spend at each visit is an important one. Do I feel like the time that I'm spending at the visit is good time? Am I being respected? Is my time being respected here? What's going to happen in between visits? What are some of the changes I might have to make to my treatment? And for each one of these elements, and even for a quite complex protocol, that we rarely presented more than about 14 or 15 elements like this to potentially eligible participants. So what we would do is we'd find a survey population, usually using an online community or a patient advocacy group, boil this down to like the 12 or 15 elements, and for each one say, does this element of taking part in a study increase your interest or decrease your interest in taking part? And then we had an open text box as to why. So we found a lot of counterintuitive findings. I've done this about 30 times with various drug sponsors, and I was very pleased to see the number of protocol amendments that they made. I was worried when we started this that they would just kind of, see the bits they liked and said, oh, well, look, I was right about that decision. But actually what we would often find is people would write out 2 or 3 pages of protocol amendments in response to the participant feedback. And typical things involved, yes, taking off some of the burdensome aspects like, if we're spending $1 billion developing this drug, maybe we can send you an Uber to pick you up and send you to the hospital instead of making you take the bus and keep the receipt, right? Can we start decentralizing more of this stuff? Can we start doing some of the things that would have been an in-person visit just to sit and fill out paper questionnaires on a clipboard, which is not a good use of time? Could we switch that to more of an electronic diary or questionnaire? But there were also some big ticket items that I was pretty impressed by that we managed to get changed. So examples like, one of our scientists wanted to do painful biopsies on people because they are interested in some particular pathology finding. Actually, when you find out that half the patients who perhaps already had that procedure during their diagnostic workup would refuse to take part if that was included, you suddenly find, okay, maybe that wasn't so essential after all, and we can cut that out. You might find that in a condition where there are 20 treatments available, if you're asking people to come off all their carefully titrated meds for a long time, and they take part in this study for 12 months, if the drug works, they would really like an open label extension in order to keep on being able to use it. In fact, if you don't do one, they won't take part. And those are the types of arguments that people within an organization or a sponsor who wanted to make those changes can actually go up to, say, senior management and say, look, if we don't do this, the trial's not going to succeed. So I think this approach has got a lot of legs. At a minimum, it can take 4 to 6 weeks to do. And you would try and get a sort of statistically meaningful sample. If you could, obviously that's harder in rare diseases, but I'd love to see approaches like this become a lot more standardized. One of the approaches we often took to, again, kind of level set the degree of, well, surely everyone's altruistic, they'll just take part in anything, would be we would ask a typical group of people, at the beginning of the questionnaire, we'd say, just in general, if your doctor suggested a clinical trial, how likely might you be to participate? And we see different rates depending on how serious the condition is. People with motor neuron disease are much more interested in trials than people with eczema, for example. But then we show them those 12 or 15 elements and we say, right, this is the specific protocol your doctor now has said that you're eligible for. How interested are you in this study? Not in a general study, in this study. And the delta between those two perhaps gives you some hint as to how much of an improvement is possible. And we would literally say, if you could tell the researchers anything, what should they hear from you? And the quantitative stuff was very good to put on slides, but it was often the qualitative remarks and findings that we heard people repeating. So this is just an example, a worked example from a phase 2 trial in a CNS disease. The types of things that would stop people from participating. I think the issue that the sponsor anticipated was that this study would involve a lumbar puncture. That actually is not what worried people. What worried people is they've spent ages trying to find the right drug for them and get it covered by insurance and get in the routine of taking it, whatever. Actually, the biggest issue for them was considering stopping their current therapy. And also that no more therapy would be available for them after they'd finished the trial, right? What's the point of that? So, actually trying to rank this stuff and quantify it is quite helpful. Yeah, you can feed that into prioritizing what amendments you might make if you're already in the middle of it. Like I say, a mixture of quantitative and qualitative questions could be good. As you go into each condition, I like to ask everybody if they've been in a clinical trial already in the past, what were the best things about it? What were the worst things about it? You might find out surprising things, even in conditions that you know relatively well. We would often ask if there was an invasive test in the study, had someone already had it before, because they can be quite common. And like I say, do people have suggestions? In terms of the during, so once we've got our protocol locked down and we've started to enroll participants, I think it's important to just have a good sense of the positive things and the negative things that can come out as you are, essentially being a customer in this journey. So airlines and hotels and software developers and things like that, think of the customer journey through a process. And I know we're not exactly in the hotel business, but I would encourage us to take some of the thinking from those industries on board. There's a variety of resources that you can use in the before, during, and after that come from groups like Transcelerate. So a study participant feedback questionnaire is available to actually get benchmark data for how participants in your study feel about it. So, at the enrollment process, do they feel they have all the information? Whilst they're taking part, do they feel comfortable? Are they convenient? But importantly, afterwards, do they know that they've finished the trial? Are they satisfied with the information? Was there a disconnect between what they thought was going to happen and what actually happened? And those resources are widely available. So in terms of afterwards, clearly I think one of the expectations, if we were participants in a trial, is we will want to know as soon as possible what were the results. Again, this is anecdotal, but I fairly frequently see on Twitter people that found out via press release whether or not their experimental treatment was effective. One of the most famous cases is a patient advocate called Hugo Campos, who found out that the medical device implanted in his chest was not actually better than sham surgery from reading about it in a press release. That's not okay, but is all too common. We saw a recent spate of tweets about a week or two ago with people who were getting reimbursed for their travel to clinical trial sites 12 months after they had actually made that visit, right? And if you think of, well, gosh, why don't we have more inclusion of a diverse set of people? Perhaps these types of barriers are reasons why. When it comes to developing lay summaries, these are sometimes very complex, very wordy. Just because it's a 300-word abstract of your 7,000-word paper doesn't really make it a lay summary. And I think maybe we're not using all the innovations we could, videos and infographics and things like that, to really make things for multiple audiences. I'm still stunned people aren't using preprints. Like I say, I work in motor neuron disease. Average prognosis is 18 months. I would endeavor to make sure that whenever I do a study, I can return results to the participants that took part, maybe even before I publish them. Use of preprints is making it easier. And then I'm just really, I'm beyond puzzled. I'm into angry that research isn't open access. A large top 10 pharmaceutical company published something the other week about a trial they clearly spent $1 billion on, but they hadn't spent the $3 grand to make it open access. That's nuts. That has to stop. I think they should legislate against that in these MHRA changes. But this means other places too. So if you're going to a conference and it's just going to be a piece of paper stuck on a wall for 3 hours, why not put the PDF up on ResearchGate? Why not put it up on Figshare? Why not make it more accessible? Right? Try and involve patients in dissemination activities as well. Some of the people you work with could be really interested in that. There are just so many ways that we can do a better job on this. And ultimately, I think we all got into research to answer questions. for people, and they ultimately pay our salaries in one way or the other. I think the study's not done just when the data file is locked or when the publication is submitted. It's not done until the community of people involved, not just our scientific peers, but the participants and caregivers and families, know what the results are of that investment of their time and a big chunk of their life. Just in the interest of time, I'm not going to go over this in much detail, but let's say we've shared one of the trials I worked with at Heal COVID, some experiences of how we've done patient and public involvement in that study throughout. We've tried to sort of put our money where our mouths are, and you can see, for example, on our website that actually the live study metrics are on the website continuously. So everyone who's taking part in the study can see how it's going, see where people are enrolling, and we're trying to convey the point of what is unfortunately some grim statistics as to what our rationale is for a study like that. So that all sounds great, Paul. Just talk to people and get patient input and everything will be wonderful, and the streets will be paved with gold. So I don't want to be naive and unrealistic about that. So there are clearly some challenges. The most significant ones is none of us ever feel like we have the time to do this, right? So, things are being locked. You need lots of rounds of comments and what have you from statisticians and safety people and compliance people and filings and salaries and costings. Isn't this just one more thing to put in the mix? I think, yes, it is. I think that there are some funders like NIHR who are trying to free up resources and make funds available so that we actually have some bandwidth for this. Like I say, I think there are increasingly now resources. You don't have to invent this yourself. You don't have to do this completely from scratch. And I think the other issue that people sometimes worry about is, well, what if we do all this and they don't teach us anything new? I'm pretty sure they will, but also, it may be that the first one-off meeting you have, if that doesn't give you the light bulb breakthrough insight, that doesn't mean that your work is done, right? So, like I say, if you're going to involve people before, during, and after, there may come other points at which you get those flashes of insight. And there are criticisms in the field. The biggest one is about tokenism and about this just being sort of a band-aid. And so I think it's important to be self-critical and reflective about the extent to which we're really climbing that ladder of citizen participation. So in closing, just to point you towards some additional resources. So some of the data I've been citing here, some of the toolkits that I've been pointing towards are freely available and often have questionnaires and things like that that can be used. The copyright is waived in a variety of circumstances, or they have sort of experts and folks like that you can contact and reach out to for more support. Sorry to give you a potential bit of work to do on a Thursday afternoon, but if you haven't already, please consider this open consultation that's open right now from MHRA. We're going to see if the Brits can find some good out of Brexit and actually make some changes to the law that I think could enshrine some of what we've been talking to into normal practice. Some big issues like making it mandated that patients are involved in trials, and some things that perhaps aren't as hard science, but I think might have a psychological impact. Not calling people subjects all over the place, for example, I think would be sensible. So, I think there's been a lot of excitement during COVID about how wonderful we've been able to react with telehealth and telemedicine and gadgets and all the rest of it. That's clearly going to revolutionize some aspects of clinical trials, but really the revolution that needs to take place doesn't come from the gizmos and the gadgets. It comes when we adopt new behaviors, new cultures, new traditions as standard practice. And I hope that all of you will accept that challenge, and happy to help any way we can along the way. So I'll hand over to Noah now. So if I pause my share, hopefully you can take over controls. There we go. And if you just come off mute. Perfect.
All right. Can you see this, folks? Thanks, Paul. So speaking of gizmos and gadgets and fun tech, I work for a company that really provides some of those solutions. I'm not going to pitch you my company. It's just by way of you understanding the perspective that I bring to this, which is really that Thread helps sponsors and CROs build the applications and the integrations that are actually necessary to stand up and run a decentralized clinical trial. Any data that would be collected away from a study site and even the data management from sites to participants who are not there, whether that's completing ECOA, telehealth visits with their clinician, any of that, device integrations, all of that. We provide services to make sure that that happens in a really effective way. But we have a range of other services, and I want to talk to you about one that we're using today that I'm pretty excited about, because I think it does give us an opportunity to try and more efficiently leverage participant feedback into where we're designing trials. And I actually work, I don't work in the tech side. My coding skills are minimal to egregious. But I do work in actually helping sponsors look at trials and say, here's how we can integrate decentralized methodologies to make this better for participants, to ensure that we're collecting the data we need, but to say, hey, wait a minute, why on earth do we have an 8-hour visit this day, 6 of which are filled with activities that could easily be completed on a phone at a different time? Let's reasonably split these visits. Like, yes, okay, you have an MRI, we're going to still do those on site, but these things don't have to be there, and helping them kind of understand the risk profile and make decisions around that. And I think including participant voice is one of the critical mechanisms to drive forward that change. So that when you say, hey, you're taking a risk that you're doing something different in a trial and you could get to the end and it could be slightly different. But listen, if you don't, you're not going to recruit people. And here's why they said it. So there's still a potential loss if you delay if you're a biotech startup and you're burning, $15 to $25 million a month. If you delay recruitment for 4 months, that is a very, very expensive delay. So making this, there's sort of ways that we try to sort of leverage patient voice to say, hey, if we make this better for people, it also benefits this bottom line. And by the way, it's the right thing to do. So in doing that, let me see if I can get my slides to switch here. Threads have made a couple of acquisitions recently. One of them, and both of these really relate to including participant patient voice early on. One is with Modus Outcomes, who helps generate outcomes, actually methodologies, which is one of the really key points. If you design trials before, one of the holdups you come is, I want to make this more patient-centric, but all the validated methodologies have to be done on paper. And by the way, they care about the color of the paper and the margins. I mean, we're sort of moving past that now, but getting really validated outcomes is a critical piece to moving towards tech. What I want to talk to you today is actually the Invive, and this is a patient listening tool. So I'm going to run through like pragmatically what this tool actually is, and then we're going to talk about a case study with it. Okay. So pragmatically, the way this tool is that we take a sponsor and we say, hey, you can submit to us a stimuli, and we're going to get patient voice feedback on this stimuli. And that stimuli could be a full study protocol. It could be a study design and schedule of assessments, schedule events. It could be an informed consent. It could be recruitment materials. Really, anything that you want us to show to a participant, we will work. We want a pre-designed stimuli. We're then going to go find a lookalike population. Now, the cool thing about this is that we're going to take your actual inclusion exclusion criteria. And then we're going to use digital recruitment to very rapidly identify and recruit participants who actually match the inclusion exclusion criteria. So we're not saying like, hey, vaguely, let's ask some people with neurodegenerative disease about this, or one person who has it. Let's actually ask someone who would be at least eligible to participate in your trial about the materials for your trial. So they'll this. Oh, sorry, I just said this. So, and then they'll be able to answer both in an app, and we actually have an appless version coming out now that will basically make sure they match. We'll find them and screen them, and then they'll recruit and download an app with these materials. But we are actually developing an appless version of this now. The participants will then review the stimuli, and they'll answer questions by voice. So this is what's really cool, is that instead of having them then fill out a long and very boring survey with hundreds of questions that you get to the end and you're like, I don't even like really care anymore. I mean, I participated in these things before. It's like, I gave up caring about it by like the 17th page of like 1 out of 5 questions, right? So by answering via voice, they're really literally recording their voice and saying, hey, here's what I care about. Here's what matters to me. And hopefully if the audio controls work, I'll show you an example of that voice later in this. Really, really, really cool. So, and when they do that, we're going to, and usually it's not too many questions because the data set is much richer when they're answering via voice. And then finally, we're going to do a quantitative and qualitative analysis. Now, I'm going to show you a little more of the quantitative side of this, but the great thing of this for kind of drug development pipeline is this whole process takes about 3 weeks, unless it's an ultra rare disease population that's hard to recruit. This is a very quick turnaround to do this. In a case study where we did this with Parkinson's patients, we went out and said, hey, we've got a Parkinson's trial. This is a hybrid decentralized trial, which means that some of the visits are occurring on study site and some of them are occurring off site. And we want to assess a variety of aspects of this trial, including do they understand the materials? Do they understand what's being expected of them? When we actually, in this case, this was actually pre-informed consent. So we really showed them the protocol. We recruited both patients and caregivers from a wide range. In this case, we kind of skewed female in our recruitment, and then kind of a range of diagnosis times from pretty early to later. And then we asked them, we had them go through this process and we asked them questions. And so I'm going to give you a couple of examples of this. So for the sake of my organization, where we're saying, hey, let's do things that are at home. We want to know, because there are instances where patients say, actually, I don't want to do it at home because I want that connection with my physician. But just over half actually preferred the at-home visits. They said, these are way better for me. And of course, due to the pandemic, they kind of very thoughtfully said, hey, look, this feels safer. This feels more interesting. And I'm not sure, hopefully, I don't know if audio is going to share here. I'm going to try and, can you hear that, Paul?
There is a virtual part of the study, reducing that travel time to and from clinics is so helpful. I think for me and for a ton of folks that are working or have trouble with transportation.
So the beauty of this data set is that when you're trying to make trials better for patients, you come back and you say, here's what they say, but here, and there's lots of tools to show this more like quantitatively, and voice tone and natural language processing and linguists are involved in this. There's lots of ways that this is sort of sophisticated and interesting, but I think there really is a fundamental reality that when you listen to what people sound like and what they say, and yes, we grade their emotion, but actually when you listen to their emotion, it's very compelling to drive a desire to make these studies actually better. And we want to make them better in fundamental core ways, not in performative ways, right? Like better by changing the visits are less burdensome, better by making it more convenient, better by making it actually collect the data we need in a way that better aligns with the lifestyle of participants. So I just want to give you another example of some of the data from this. So this is one of the questions we asked, which is, I'm going to find the question. I said, okay, next, let's talk. The question they responded to is, next, let's talk about the section regarding participant responsibilities. What, if anything, is unclear or confusing about participant responsibilities? And then they have an open-ended voice question. And what's cool is you get feedback about how you're actually doing things and why, for example, a lot of informed consents are really bad. You can kind of garner that feedback and hopefully improve the process. And here's part of what one individual who's a caregiver for a Parkinson's patient said about participant responsibilities.
I think for the most part, everything was clear. I was a little confused with the graph and the treatment period. If that's the part you are talking about, it seems like a lot of information in the charts, and I do believe that was a little confusing.
So I think I'm not going to dive too far into this tool, this specific sort of voice assessment tool, but I do want to talk and just think very, very briefly here at the end before we go to questions about sort of the future of patient voice. I mean, I think from the tech side and from the service provider to clinical trials side, I think we are seeing significant improvements in listening to participants. And I think we're working really hard to actually have this, because I mean, I'm in this because I want to make trials better for people. I want to because I don't want to waste so much time in drug development. I want them to be able to fail faster if they're not good, so we can put that money into drugs that are going to be there for people. And I want the entire process of participating in a clinical trial to be less challenging and burdensome. And I think hearing what people's experience like is so critical to that. And so I think tools like this do help solve things like giving feedback to study design, actually asking the people who would be in the study what they think. And the others that are involved too, caregivers, for example, can be really critical depending on your indication in the population. And it's not just sort of professional patients. So there's kind of a group of people whose job it is to talk to pharma companies about being a patient. And I actually really applaud those patient advocates and am friends with them. But over time, they tend to develop a certain perspective because they do it so much, right? Compared to individuals who maybe are a little more naive to the process, there's a lot more freshness to that feedback and on the ground reality. What this doesn't solve is that a lot of trials still have huge barriers, right? If you have to come off your medication, we saw from the graph with Paul, it's listening to someone say that sucks is not going to do anything to change that about a study. And there are a lot of pieces of that make it difficult, like doubling of inclusion and exclusion criteria in the last decade. That funnel doesn't really get better by listening to someone say, it sucks because I was hoping to get on this cancer therapy because it's my last line, but I took this third line defense and now I'm ineligible. So I'm just going to die. Like there's no listening to that doesn't necessarily solve some of those challenges. And there are still major barriers to historically marginalized communities that listening to a few patient voices is not going to fix these dramatic systemic issues we're facing. But I do think for the future, there is economics argue that listening to participants will happen, right? Because we actually are competing for smaller patient populations. So there's that money driver in pharma, and for whatever reasons that does matter. But I do think there's going to be a little bit of fragmentation. Unfortunately, I don't think we're going to see this like monolithic adoption of wonderful patient-centric research. I think you're going to see it really, really good in certain areas and then performative in other areas and maybe not so much. But I think when we can change the way organizations approach trial design by implementing technologies like this, it can be one of the largest drivers of actually making sure that we're engaging participant voice in this entire sort of giant system that we're all part of here. So I think with that, I'll open up to questions.